The night shift had ended hours ago, yet Emily Carter's weary eyes refused to close. A registered nurse working double shifts at a small-town hospital, she carried the heavy weight of exhaustion, unpaid bills, and the loneliness of a life spent giving to everyone but herself. Her apartment was modest, her meals simple, and her wardrobe practical. Nothing about her screamed luxury, yet everything about her spoke of resilience. She had grown accustomed to mending wounds that weren't her own, to comforting strangers while suppressing her own fears. But one fateful morning, as she left the hospital with her scrubs wrinkled and her hair tucked messily beneath a cap, she noticed a man sitting in the waiting area. He wasn't just any patient, his posture spoke of years spent carrying burdens too heavy for one person, and his frail cough echoed with a sadness that was more than just physical. Emily paused, her heart instinctively tugged in his direction. His chart revealed he was a widower, recently admitted for complications from a lingering illness. His name, Daniel Hayes. There was something striking about him despite his weakness, a dignity in his manner, a quiet sorrow that seemed to reach beyond his pale frame. Emily, who rarely allowed herself to linger with patients once her shift ended, found herself asking softly, "Do you need anything before I leave?" He looked up, surprised by her kindness, and for a brief moment, his eyes, deep and burdened with loss, met hers. That single exchange would alter the course of both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. Daniel Hayes was unlike most patients Emily had cared for. He never complained about his discomfort, never demanded special treatment, and always greeted her with a polite, "Thank you," no matter how small the gesture. Over the following weeks, Emily learned that he was a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. His grief was still fresh, woven into his words whenever he mentioned her name. He had one son, a teenager named Michael, who lived with relatives because Daniel's illness had made it difficult to provide the stability his boy needed. Despite his circumstances, Daniel carried himself with quiet strength, and that stirred something deep inside Emily. She was used to seeing people give up when life turned cruel, but Daniel's spirit was different. He was wounded but not broken. In the quiet hours when she checked his vitals, they spoke about life, dreams, and the small joys they still held on to. Emily found herself laughing at his dry humor, surprised by the comfort she felt in his company. For someone who had spent years guarding her heart, she realized Daniel was slowly slipping past her defenses. One evening, as the sun painted the hospital windows gold, he whispered, "I don't fear the pain as much as I fear being forgotten." Emily didn't know what to say, but something inside her ached at the thought. She went home that night thinking about him, replaying his words like a melody she couldn't silence. The struggling nurse who had lived her life in service to strangers suddenly found herself caring for one man in a way that terrified her, because this time, the risk wasn't just losing sleep or comfort. It was losing her heart. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's condition grew more complicated. His illness required constant monitoring, yet Emily often volunteered for his care, even when it meant sacrificing her own rest. Her co-workers noticed the unusual bond but said nothing, quietly respecting the unspoken tenderness that passed between them. Emily, though struggling financially, began bringing him small comforts, homemade soup, fresh flowers, and even a worn copy of his favorite book she found at a thrift store. Daniel's eyes lit up each time, his gratitude overwhelming in its sincerity. In return, he offered her something she hadn't felt in years, the sense of being truly seen. Emily was used to people noticing her only when they needed something, her patients, her landlord, her creditors. But Daniel noticed the way she tapped her fingers when anxious, the way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening, the way her kindness never seemed to run dry despite her struggles. Their conversations deepened, spilling into topics of faith, regret, and second chances. Daniel often spoke about his late wife with reverence, but Emily never felt like an intruder. Instead, she felt honored to be trusted with such sacred memories. One late evening, as she adjusted his blanket, Daniel caught her hand and held it, his touch fragile yet firm. "Emily," he said softly, "I thought my story ended the day I buried her. But you've shown me that even broken people can be given another chapter." His words left Emily breathless, her chest tightening with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. That night, as she walked home under the glow of streetlights, her heart wrestled with an impossible question: was she falling in love with a man who might not live long enough to love her back? Emily tried to silence the growing feelings in her heart, but love has a way of blooming in the most impossible soil. The more time she spent with Daniel, the more she realized how rare his spirit was: gentle, thoughtful, resilient. He began encouraging her, reminding her of her worth when she doubted herself, urging her not to let exhaustion or financial struggles define her. In many ways, Daniel gave her back the very hope she had been giving to others all her life. Still, Emily feared the future. His illness loomed like a shadow, and she wondered what it would mean to love someone who was slipping away. Yet, Daniel had a way of making the present so beautiful that the future almost didn't matter. One evening, during a hospital fundraiser, Daniel, frail but determined, asked Emily to dance. The sight of him standing with effort, extending his hand with trembling courage, drew tears to her eyes. She placed her hand in his, and though the music was soft, their connection drowned out everything else. "I don't have much time left," Daniel whispered as they swayed, "but I want to spend whatever days I do have with someone who makes them feel worth living." Emily's heart ached, torn between reason and desire. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see a dying man, she saw the kind of love she had always dreamed of: selfless, profound, unshaken by circumstances. That night, Daniel asked her a question that left her breathless: "Emily Carter, would you marry me?" The room spun, her heart racing with fear and joy colliding. And though the world would never understand why a struggling nurse would choose to marry a sick widower, Emily already knew the answer her heart had been whispering all along. The proposal shocked Emily, not because she hadn't sensed their growing closeness, but because she never imagined someone would want to share forever with her. She had always lived in survival mode, never allowing herself to believe she deserved something as sacred as marriage. Yet here was Daniel, fragile in body but steadfast in spirit, offering her the one thing she thought life had stolen from her: a family. Emily wrestled with doubt. Her friends cautioned her gently, worried she was making an emotional decision that could break her heart. "He doesn't have much time," one nurse warned. "Are you ready to live through another kind of loss?" But Emily's answer came not from logic, but from love. She had already lived with loss every day: loss of dreams, loss of rest, loss of hope. Loving Daniel didn't feel like another risk, it felt like redemption. With trembling hands, she accepted his proposal, her yes carrying the weight of sacrifice and the lightness of hope all at once. The small-town chapel where they wed was simple: no grand gowns, no extravagant flowers, just vows whispered with sincerity. Daniel's son, Michael, stood by his father's side, hesitant but curious about the woman who had brought light back into his dad's eyes. As Emily slipped the modest ring onto Daniel's finger, she silently promised not just to love him, but to carry his burdens as her own. The guests were few, but the love in that room was vast, wrapping around them like a blessing. For Emily, it wasn't about gaining security or wealth; there was none to be had. It was about choosing love, even when the world insisted it didn't make sense. And for Daniel, it was about daring to believe that even at the edge of life, miracles could still happen. Married life for Emily and Daniel was far from glamorous, but it was filled with quiet moments that felt like treasures. They lived together in Daniel's small house, where the walls still carried faint reminders of his late wife: family portraits, a quilt she had stitched, books with her handwriting in the margins. At first, Emily felt like a guest in someone else's story, but Daniel assured her gently, "This is our home now." Every morning, Emily rose early to prepare his medications before heading to her demanding hospital shifts. And every evening, she returned to find Daniel waiting, often with a soft smile, sometimes with dinner halfway prepared despite his frailty. Their days were simple: shared cups of tea, evening walks when Daniel was strong enough, laughter over silly television shows. But in those ordinary routines, Emily found extraordinary joy. Slowly, she also began to connect with Michael, Daniel's teenage son. At first, Michael resisted, struggling with guilt over his mother's memory and distrust toward the new woman in his father's life. But Emily never forced herself into his world. She listened, cared, and stood patiently at the edges of his pain until he allowed her closer. The first time Michael called her Emily, instead of just her, she felt like she had been handed a priceless gift. Despite the lingering shadow of Daniel's illness, their little family began to heal together. Yet, in the quiet moments when she watched Daniel sleep, Emily couldn't silence the ache of knowing time was slipping through their fingers. She whispered prayers into the silence, asking for just a little more time, enough for Daniel to see his son grow, enough for them to fully savor the love they had finally found. Life had taught her not to expect miracles, but her heart couldn't stop hoping. Despite their happiness, life remained a relentless test of endurance. Emily's nursing salary barely stretched far enough to cover medical bills, groceries, and the roof over their heads. Some nights she skipped meals so Daniel and Michael could eat, hiding her sacrifices behind a smile. She told herself it didn't matter, she had endured far worse alone, and now, at least, she had love to sustain her. Daniel noticed, though. Even when she tried to disguise her weariness, he could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled after a long double shift. "You give too much," he told her one evening, holding her hand with quiet concern. "One day you'll run dry." Emily only shook her head, whispering, "Love doesn't run dry, Daniel. Not when it's real." His eyes filled with tears, because in those words he heard not just devotion, but the strength of a woman who had built her life on selflessness. Still, the weight of their struggles was undeniable. Michael, seeing Emily's sacrifices, began pitching in, taking a part-time job after school, surprising her by fixing things around the house, and slowly shifting from wary teenager to protective son. Their bond grew stronger, and Emily realized she wasn't just gaining a husband, but also earning the trust of a child who needed her. Yet even as their little family found resilience in love, the shadow of Daniel's worsening illness hung heavy. Each doctor's visit seemed to bring more grim predictions, each scan confirming what they already knew: time was slipping away. But instead of letting despair take root, Emily doubled down on her devotion. She clung fiercely to every smile, every laugh, every heartbeat she could share with Daniel. And though the world saw only struggle, Emily felt she was living a miracle every single day. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted down the quiet street outside, Daniel sat Emily down at the kitchen table. His hands shook as he reached across, clasping hers with an urgency she had never felt before. "Emily," he began, his voice raspy but steady, "there's something I need you to promise me." Her heart tightened. Promises in a house shadowed by illness often carried the weight of final goodbyes. "Take care of Michael," he said simply, his eyes glistening. "If I can't, I need to know he'll have someone who loves him the way his mother did." Emily's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She had already grown to love the boy as her own, but hearing Daniel voice his deepest fear and trust shook her. "I promise," she whispered, pressing his hand to her heart. A silence followed, heavy with emotion, broken only by Michael's footsteps as he entered the room. He had overheard, and his teenage defenses crumbled as he dropped his backpack and wrapped his arms around both of them. For the first time, their little family didn't just feel like a fragile arrangement, it felt whole. That night, Emily realized something profound: love wasn't about avoiding pain or pretending life was fair. Love was about choosing someone's heart even when you knew it might break your own. In the glow of that fragile moment, she knew she would carry Daniel's love and Michael's trust no matter what came next. And though the fear of the future lingered, so too did a quiet strength that whispered, "You were made for this." Winter arrived, and with it came nights of relentless snow and deeper worries. Daniel's health declined faster than any of them had anticipated. Hospital visits became more frequent, and Emily often found herself torn between her duty as a nurse to other patients and her desperate need to be at Daniel's side. Some days she felt stretched so thin she thought she would shatter. Yet, every time Daniel squeezed her hand or Michael smiled shyly after doing the dishes, she discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. Their home, though small and worn, became a sanctuary filled with warmth no storm could touch. On Christmas Eve, Emily prepared a modest dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a pie she had stayed up all night baking after her shift. Daniel, weak but determined, insisted on sitting at the table. Michael lit candles, and for a few sacred hours, illness and poverty faded into the background. They laughed, shared stories, and exchanged handmade gifts. Emily had sewn a scarf for Daniel from old fabric scraps, while Daniel had written her a letter, pages filled with gratitude and love that left her sobbing quietly as she read. Michael, meanwhile, presented Emily with a simple framed drawing of the three of them, titled Family. It was the first time he had ever openly called her that. Emily held the picture against her chest, overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment. That night, as snow blanketed the world outside, Emily whispered a silent prayer of thanks. They had so little in material wealth, yet she realized they possessed something far greater: love that refused to surrender, even in the face of loss. And though fear of the future lingered, Emily understood she was living through a season she would treasure for the rest of her life. By early spring, the fragility of their lives became more apparent. Daniel's once steady steps grew unsteady, his voice softer, his laughter shorter. Emily adjusted her shifts at the hospital, sacrificing income so she could be home more often. Bills piled higher on the kitchen counter, but she refused to let worry overshadow the fleeting time they had together. Michael, now more open with her than ever, began helping in ways that surprised her, managing household chores, tutoring younger kids for pocket money, even learning to cook simple meals. He had matured faster than most boys his age, his resilience born from hardship and love. One afternoon, as Emily returned from a grueling shift, she found Daniel sitting on the porch, Michael beside him. They were watching the sunset, a sight painted with hues of pink and gold. Daniel reached for her hand as she sat down, his skin thin and cool. "I used to think my illness was a punishment," he confessed quietly. "But then you came into my life, Emily, and I realized maybe it was God's way of leading me to one last blessing." She fought back tears, her heart torn between gratitude and grief. Michael leaned against her shoulder, his presence a silent affirmation that love had given them all something to cling to. As the sky darkened, Emily felt both the weight and wonder of their shared journey. They were not living a fairy tale, they were living something far deeper, a truth that love doesn't always change circumstances, but it transforms hearts. And in that moment, surrounded by fading light and fragile breaths, she realized they had built something unbreakable, a family knit together not by chance, but by choice. The days that followed were heavy with both tenderness and dread. Daniel's condition worsened, and every small task became a challenge. Yet he faced each moment with remarkable grace, often comforting Emily instead of the other way around. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the hospital, Emily returned home to find Daniel waiting for her in the living room, his Bible open on his lap. His voice was weak, but his eyes shone with determination. "Emily," he said softly, "I need you to hear this. If tomorrow doesn't come for me, I want you to remember that you gave me something I thought I had lost forever: hope." Her chest ached as she knelt beside him, holding his hand to her cheek. "Don't talk like that," she whispered, her tears falling freely. "We still have time." Daniel smiled faintly, brushing away her tears with trembling fingers. "Time isn't measured by days, Emily. It's measured by love. And you've given me more than I ever dreamed I'd have again." Michael, who had been listening from the hallway, stepped forward and joined them, slipping his hand into Emily's. For the first time, Emily realized she wasn't just Daniel's wife, she was becoming Michael's mother in every way that mattered. The three of them sat there together, the silence filled with unspoken truths. Emily's heart broke under the weight of impending loss, but it also swelled with the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Love had led her here, not the safe kind, not the easy kind, but the kind that demanded everything and gave back even more. And though fear loomed, so too did the quiet certainty that love had already won. One early morning, Emily woke to the sound of Daniel's labored breathing. Panic surged through her as she rushed to his side, finding his face pale and his body trembling with weakness. She called the ambulance, her training kicking in even as her heart shattered. At the hospital, surrounded by the sterile beeping of machines she knew all too well, Emily clung to Daniel's hand. He looked at her with a faint smile, as though trying to ease her fear. "Don't cry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Remember what I told you, love measures time." Emily couldn't stop the tears that streamed down her cheeks. Michael stood at the foot of the bed, his fists clenched, his young face etched with fear. Daniel motioned for him to come closer, and with the last of his strength, he placed Emily's hand in Michael's. "You too, you're my heart," he breathed, "take care of each other." His words hung in the air, fragile and sacred, as though the universe itself had paused to listen. Emily pressed her forehead against his, whispering, "I love you. Always." And with one final breath, Daniel closed his eyes, his grip loosening as peace settled over his face. The room grew unbearably still, and in that silence, Emily felt her world split in two. She had lost her husband, her partner, her greatest gift, and yet, in that same moment, she felt the weight of the promise she had made. Michael's small, trembling hand was still in hers, anchoring her to the living. Through her grief, she understood, Daniel hadn't left her alone. He had left her with a son, with a purpose, with a love strong enough to carry them both forward. The weeks after Daniel's passing were some of the hardest days Emily had ever known. Grief came in waves, sometimes crashing so fiercely she could hardly breathe, other times arriving like a quiet ache that lingered no matter what she did. But through it all, she kept her promise, to Daniel, and to herself. Michael became her anchor. He grieved too, retreating into silence some days, exploding with anger on others, but slowly, he began leaning on Emily in ways that surprised them both. She cooked meals for him, listened when he was ready to talk, and sat with him in silence when words wouldn't come. At first, he called her Emily, the distance in his voice reminding her of how new and fragile their bond still was. But one evening, as she tucked a blanket over him when he fell asleep on the couch, he stirred and whispered half dreaming, "Good night, Mom." Emily froze, tears flooding her eyes. It was the first time he had called her that, and the word wrapped around her heart like a promise of healing. She knew then that Daniel's love still lived, not just in her, but in his son. Though the house felt emptier without him, it was also filled with echoes of his laughter, his words, and his dreams for them. Emily began to see her own struggles differently too. Where once she had seen herself as barely surviving, she now recognized her strength, the ability to create a home, to heal broken hearts, to carry forward a legacy of love. And in that realization, she discovered something Daniel had always known: even in loss, life could still give back in unexpected, beautiful ways. Spring arrived again, bringing blossoms that seemed to whisper renewal, and Emily began to rebuild her life with Michael by her side. She poured herself into both nursing and motherhood, balancing her demanding shifts with the needs of a teenage boy still learning to navigate life without his father. It wasn't easy. There were mornings she woke with tears on her pillow, nights she came home so exhausted she could hardly stand. But every time Michael left a note on the counter saying, "Thanks for dinner, Mom," or surprised her with a drawing for the fridge, her heart swelled with strength. One afternoon, as they cleaned out Daniel's study, Emily discovered a sealed envelope tucked in the back of a drawer. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a letter addressed to her. In Daniel's familiar handwriting, he wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I've gone. I need you to know something I never told you while I was alive, something that may change how you see yourself. I set aside savings from my late wife's insurance policy years ago. It isn't much, but it's enough to give you and Michael some stability. I wanted you to know that you don't have to carry everything alone anymore." Emily's eyes blurred with tears as she read on. Daniel wrote of his gratitude for her love, of the peace she had brought him, and of his faith that she and Michael would build a beautiful life together. In that moment, Emily felt both the ache of loss and the gift of relief. Daniel hadn't just left her with love, he had left her with a safety net, a sign that even in his final days, he had been thinking of her future. Emily folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her heart as Michael looked on with questioning eyes. She smiled through her tears, pulling him close. "Your dad thought of everything," she whispered, her voice trembling with both grief and gratitude. From that day forward, the weight she carried felt lighter, not because life suddenly became easy, but because she knew Daniel's love still guided them. The small savings he left allowed her to reduce her double shifts, giving her more time to be present for Michael. Together, they began creating new traditions: Friday movie nights, Sunday breakfasts, and long walks where they talked about dreams and memories. Michael grew to trust her fully, not just as his father's wife but as his mother in every way that mattered. The boy who once kept his guard up now leaned on her, his laughter echoing through the house that once felt empty. And Emily, once the struggling nurse who thought her life was only about sacrifice, discovered that love had transformed her story. She was no longer defined by hardship, but by the resilience and grace that came from giving her heart without fear. At Daniel's graveside one spring morning, Emily placed fresh flowers and whispered, "We're okay. You gave us everything we needed, even the strength to keep going." The wind stirred gently, and for a moment, she felt as though he was still beside her, smiling. As she walked back to where Michael was waiting, she realized the shocking revelation wasn't just about the money Daniel had left, it was about the truth she had learned: love is never wasted, and even the briefest chapters can change a life forever. With hope rekindled, Emily stepped into the future, not alone, but with a family born of love's unbreakable promise.